all biographies ought to report events with precision. No, they don't. Ancient biographies did not. So it's a genre mistake there.
And all writing is selective. You can't include everything. You can't include every detail. Some of these differences can be harmonized, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, wrote a book, When Critics Ask, and many of these differences can be harmonized, but some of them seem to resist harmonization. That you really got to jump through a lot of hoops to get them to say, well, there's not a difference here that is a contradiction. Now, before I get there, Mike, I want to ask you to give us an example.
In real quick here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Your co-author, Dr. Geisler, was very critical of me for suggesting with a slew of other New Testament scholars that John he displaced the temple cleansing from the end of Jesus' ministry and transplanted it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So Mike Licona admits there's error, that John made an error. Well, I never said John made an error, but he took it that way. But you know what I learned later? As I read the book you just mentioned, the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, Geisler and Howell say in there that when it comes to Jesus' cleansing of the temple, that Matthew moved the event from Monday to Sunday and conflated it with the first temple visit. So they acknowledged that Matthew was doing the very thing that I said that John was doing, and yet why is it that it was an error that I was saying, but they were fine with it?
Well, it's interesting that we had Jimmy Akin on the show last week, a Catholic apologist that debated Bart Ehrman as well. And one of the things he was saying, which is sort of the same thing you're saying, is that in ancient times, a biography could move events around, or biographer could move events around for certain stylistic purposes. And so strict chronology was not necessarily expected.
That's right.
In fact, is it Luke that said, or is it Papias that talked about Luke? I can't remember how this goes, Mike, you would know, but that Luke was Luke says, I want an orderly account. The implication is maybe Mark's gospel wasn't in necessarily strict chronological order and Luke wanted it to be. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. What did he mean when he said he composed and put these things together in an orderly manner? Well, it's not chronological because a lot of times he's doing it thematically. So I think that's probably more of what we're looking at here, to communicate themes and things like that than chronology.
When we watch a movie or even a biography, there are times when the writer will put a whole bunch of events together in order to make a point or a dramatic scene, even though they may not have been in that strict chronological order. And when we're watching that, other subplots in the story are going on concurrently, but the writer doesn't stop and say, okay, now let me go to this subplot right now because this is happening right now. He stays with the scene he's with, and then he comes back and he says, let me pick up the subplot now, even though it's not in strict chronological order. Is that what could be done here in the ancient world as well?
Yeah. You definitely have that in the ancient writers. In fact, you have others like J.L. Moles, a classicist, saying that this was universally done amongst ancient writers and historians.
Well, we're gonna look at another supposed error in the Bible when we come back and apply what Mike writes in his new book, Jesus Contradicted, to it, so you can see if it makes sense to you or not. So don't go anywhere. We're going to look at a supposed error in the scriptures in just a second. But Dr. Licona, Dr. Mike Licona, my guest, wants to say something about the definition of inerrancy, which we've already pointed out. It's not really defined very much in the scriptures. We're kind of putting scriptures together to come up with it, and we're not quite sure we have the right definition. But say what you wanted to say about inerrancy, Mike, before we move on to that supposed error.
Yeah, I think some of your viewers probably feeling a little anxiety over this. Wow, there could be some errors in our present text. I wasn't even aware of that they're in our present text, much less possibility in the autographs or the originals, like Licona is saying. So why won't that, isn't that a slippery slope just to kind of, that leads to giving up trust in the Gospels? Well, wait a minute. We already have errors in our present text, okay? And why do you still trust the present text? Because you believe that God in his sovereignty, because he loved us so much that it resulted in the incarnation, that God in his sovereignty would ensure that everything that we would need to know for salvation and living the Christian life and knowing God was preserved with sufficient accuracy. That's why we have confidence in Scripture, even though those who embrace the Chicago Statement acknowledge that there are errors in our present Bible. Well, I would say the same thing, even if we acknowledge the possibility of errors in the originals, that because God loved us so much that it resulted in the incarnation, he would see to it in his sovereignty that everything he wanted us to know about salvation, knowing him, living the Christian life, was preserved with sufficient accuracy. The confidence is built for the same reason, whether you take a traditional view of inerrancy or a more flexible view, as I do.
Yeah, in fact, we're going to get into that flexible view here in just a few minutes. But I also want to point out that no matter what internal debate we have over what is the proper definition of inerrancy and what is an error and what isn't, it doesn't change the big picture one iota. And even somebody like Bart Ehrman would agree with that the essential doctrines of the faith remain solid, even if we're arguing over, did someone make an error?